It's that time of year when teachers are starting to think about professional development and continuing education courses for the summer. I am so excited to announce that the Savvy Dance Teacher Applied Dance Science Teacher Training course is back again for another year. It's happening September 1st and 2nd in the Vancouver area, and registration is now open. For those of you who may not know, the Savvy Dance Teacher is a 2-day in-person practical course that covers the latest in applied dance science topics. If you're looking to incorporate more injury prevention, functional anatomy, active mobility, strength and conditioning, and lots of other stuff into your teaching, this is the course for you. For more information, check out www.allegroperformance.com/thesavvydanceteacher. And if you use the code SAVVYEB before July 1st, you can save $100 off your registration. And now, here's today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, I want to talk a little bit about overtraining, but from a bit of a different lens than I've probably talked about it in the past. So in the dance world and in other sports worlds as well, but definitely in the dance world, there's a lot of discussion around overtraining and training loads and overuse injuries. Like, we know the statistics. We know that about 75% of dance injuries are what we would classify as overuse injuries. And so I think there is this perception that those overuse injuries always come from overtraining. But today I want to kind of examine a different angle of this, or a different side of this, and perhaps open the idea or start a discussion around what if overtraining is not necessarily the issue in some of these quote unquote overuse injuries. And don't get me wrong, overtraining is 100% an issue in dance. And I have talked about that quite extensively. And so I'm not by any means saying like, oh, let's just throw out all of our training load recommendations and all of that. I just want to kind of look at things from a little bit of a different or more nuanced angle today. So if you are interested in actual like training loads or training load recommendations, I did a podcast episode on that ages ago, a couple of years ago. So episode 10 is called Training Load Management for Dancers. And I will link that in the show notes. And that goes through sort of what our recommendations are for training loads in dance. So I have covered that. Those parameters generally still hold. But today, like I said, I just want to kind of come at this from a little bit of a different lens. And part of the reason for this is I was having a discussion with a local dance teacher recently she's actually a studio owner, but also still teaches classes. And they've had a bit of an uptick in injuries this year in their studio, where she was sort of describing it a bit as like I don't want to say like an epidemic, but she was a bit like, what is happening? Why are all of our dancers getting injured? We haven't changed our training programs. And she's very, very, very cognizant of training loads and knows that her dancers are not overtraining. And so then the question became, what is this sort of like increase or uptick that we're seeing in injuries in this cohort of dancers? And, you know, they were injuries that would potentially be classified as like overuse injuries. We're not talking about a lot of like acute injuries that were happening, but she just had more dancers than normal experiencing injuries this season. And because she is very aware of these issues, she was reaching out to say, you know, what are we doing wrong, or what could we be doing differently? And I love that as a studio owner and a teacher, that this is like her immediate first thought is like, wait a second, what do we as a studio need to do to address this? Because for her, she knew from the research and, from she's taken courses with me and things like that, she knew that her dancers were not exceeding recommended training hours. So on paper, they are not necessarily overtraining or being overloaded. So then the question becomes, what else could potentially be going on in a situation like that? I have also seen a little bit of discussions around similar topics kind of floating around the internet right now. So it seems like a few people are maybe on the same page, or people are sort of noticing the same things. So I thought it would be an interesting topic to kind of dive into today. I will say that there could be so many things at play in a scenario like this where we're seeing an uptick of injuries, but we are, thinking that it's not related to overtraining in terms of like training load. I am not going to get into all of the possibilities of what that could be. There's so much nuance that can go into that and just so many things at play, but I want to cover two things in particular. And I wasn't even going to actually include the first one, but I came across a social media post just yesterday and was like, do you know what? Let's actually have a little chat about this as well. So first of all, I want to just say that there is a difference in quality versus quantity of training or of the teaching that is going on in a studio. And in general, when we think about how we're loading the body and how dancers' bodies are going to withstand load, we generally want to pick quality over quantity. And this does come back to that training load. So if you are not overtraining your dancers and, by loading on too many hours into their schedule, chances are you're not picking the quantity part of things. So really looking at the quality of the training. But even in dancers or dance teachers or studio settings where dancers are not being overloaded from an hour perspective, there is a difference in how we are training dancers. And the post I saw on social media, I feel like sums it up really well. And the post was something along the lines of, there is a difference between teaching a class and sharing your choreography. It was a little bit longer than that, but that is the piece I want to pull out. And what I am seeing commonly in the dance world is that we are seeing a lot of what would be deemed as almost like sharing choreography. But what I'm seeing it as a studio, in a studio setting, is a lot of drilling of choreography. So it's doing the same things over and over and over and over again, potentially at the expense of not actually teaching class or working on technique and building on certain principles and exploring different movement patterns and exploring different movement qualities and things like that. There seems to have been, and I will say, this is maybe a bit more prevalent in the competition dance world, but it is certainly not exclusive to the competition dance world. I've seen it in all settings, and I don't want to get into, the potential reasons why we might be seeing more of this happening. But I know I've had conversations with people who, even at a, professional and especially commercial dance level, are seeing this happen and are sort of complaining about it, where they're saying, I'm going to class, but it's not actually class. It's a teacher doing a warm up and then teaching us a combo and then spending the whole rest of the class filming that combo. And so it's this idea of drilling the same thing over and over again. And especially during competition times of the season, if we want that dance to be clean and polished and look good on stage, it makes sense that we're drilling that same thing over and over again. But are we doing that at the expense of also still having technique classes or other classes where we can actually be learning and breaking things down and exploring different movement qualities and movement patterns, because the way the body perceives those two things is quite different. So if we take the same amount of time, so if we're thinking of training load, and I'll actually get into training load in a second again and kind of what it is, because I realize I've been throwing this word out, but some of you may not actually know exactly what that is. So I will come back to that in 1 second, but I just want to finish this thought. if we take the same amount of time, so say a 1 hour class, and we have a dancer who's drilling the same combo or the same choreography or whatever it is for that hour. So they're just doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again to clean it, polish it, perfect it, whatever, versus a dancer who is doing an hour class, and that hour class is being really intentionally taught to explore whatever it is on that given day. So maybe it's looking at like foundational technique. Maybe it's a class that starts with like a warm up and then a bar and then moves to, technical stuff and then moves to more performance quality. Like there's more of an intention behind it. There's going to be more variety and variability in that second class than in that first class. So in terms of how our body can withstand that load or what the effects of that are going to be when we think about repetitive overuse injuries, the training load is the same in theory if we think about it from a time perspective, that 1 hour. But how the body is able to withstand that load is going to be quite different. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about this kind of like quality over quantity. It's not just, is it a good teacher? Is it a bad teacher? That is not at all what I'm trying to say. It's how are these classes being designed, or rehearsals or whatever it is, so that we're actually thinking about the quality of our teaching and really helping to develop some of those skills and some of that athleticism and some of those foundational movement patterns in our dancers, and not just drilling the same thing over and over and over again. So that is what I want to say about sort of the first kind of broad topic. And again, I wasn't really going to get into that, but then I've just seen some things floating around on social media and felt like we should include that. The second bigger topic that I want to kind of dive into again in this idea of maybe it is not overtraining is perhaps in some cases it is actually that the dancers are underprepared for the loads that they are undergoing or withstanding. And so it all falls along a similar continuum, but there's oftentimes this idea that we're always blaming overuse. And sometimes it may not be overuse. Sometimes it may be under preparation or under training. Before I dive into that more, I do want to just break down training load a little bit because I realize I've been throwing it out and not everybody may know what I'm talking about. So when we talk about training load, what we are talking about is the cumulative stress that is being placed on an individual, so on their body, but on an individual as a human, from a single or multiple training sessions. So it is this cumulative load. So in dance, it's often going to be from multiple training sessions because we often are doing multiple classes on one day or multiple rehearsals on one day. But the technical definition is just this cumulative training load stress being placed on the individual from either single or multiple sessions. Training load is a product of intensity times duration times frequency. I'll say that again. So training load is a product of the intensity, so how intense the activity is that we're participating in, times the duration, so how long it is lasting for, and then the frequency, so how often are we participating in this activity. And there are different ways of measuring training load, but the most common way that we measure it is through external measurements. And the easiest one that we use in the dance world, and it is probably not super accurate, but it is what we use because it is what we have available right now for the most part. We are almost always using an external measure of time. So we're usually using a measure of hours. So if I have a dancer coming into the clinic, initial intake, first time I'm meeting them, one of my questions is always going to be, how many hours a week do you dance? And that is my way of getting a snippet of information about what their training load potentially is. And so again, it is not the most accurate representation because if we think about that intensity variable of training load, we know that, we can have 2 different hours of dance that can be very different in intensity. You could have 1 hour that's like quite low in intensity. Maybe you're cleaning something and you're not heavily involved in that part of the dance. And so there's a lot of standing around. And you could have a second hour that's like a super, super high intensity class where you're just absolutely wiped by the end. So using an external measurement of time is not always super accurate. However, it is what we tend to use in the dance world. I think we are starting to see some better measurements coming out with being able to use more technology. And so we're starting to see people use more internal measurements of training load. So things like heart rate recovery or heart rate variability or other measures like that. And as we have more accessible wearable technology, we'll see some of those things change. But for now, generally, when we think of training load, we're often using the measurement of time. So hopefully that's clear to everyone. Like I said, if you want more information just strictly on training load, go back to episode 10 and have a listen to that one if you've not already, because I go into more detail in that episode. But I want to come back to this idea that perhaps it's not so much overuse or overtraining that is happening as this idea of under preparation. And one of my favorite quotes, and I use this quote all the time when I'm teaching. So if you've ever taken one of my courses, especially the Savvy Dance Teacher course, which is like the applied dance science course, you will know this quote. But it's not the load that breaks an individual down. It's the load that they're not prepared for. And this quote comes from Tim Gabbett, and he's essentially like the grandfather. I mean, maybe not so much grandfather. He's not that old, maybe the father, but he is an applied sports scientist and he is incredibly well known and highly respected. I have like so much respect for him, but he's, like I said, kind of the grandfather of a lot of the research and information we have about load management and injury prevention and how the two are connected, and really how to apply this information to kind of high performance cultures and high performance environments. So he is, like I said, just like a wealth of knowledge and a lot of the published literature that we have on this topic. He is one of the authors, if not the lead author on. And I just love that quote, and I'll read it again, but it's not the load that breaks an individual down. It's the load that they are not prepared for. So again, this comes down to this idea of perhaps it's not just overtraining, like they're loading too much. Maybe they're just not prepared for the load that they are actually participating in. And so this is where this idea of maybe actually like underloading or at least under preparation comes into play. And coincidentally, recently, and I can't remember when it was, Dance Prehab on Instagram. If you are not following them yet, go follow Dance Prehab. Rob is absolutely fantastic. He has such great ways of synthesizing a lot of this information in a really amazing way of how he approaches the idea of training humans who are dancers or who are dancing. And in fact, I'm going to try and get him on the podcast at some point because he is just fabulous. Anyway, Dance Prehab had a graphic on their Instagram account recently. I will try and find it and link it in the show notes as well, but that kind of expanded on this idea. And it was a really nice graphic in terms of like the visual of what we can look at. And so when we kind of think about these dancers who are maybe underprepared or underloaded, we can break that down into kind of different categories of loading preparedness. I don't know if that's the right word. And so the first category would be dancers who are what we would deem to be load naive. So these are dancers who have potentially had limited exposure to high levels of loading. So they may just not yet have developed some of the physical capacity or the coordination or the tolerance to these higher loads that might be necessary. And I see this really commonly in dancers who are going from potentially a recreational dance program to all of a sudden they're all in, like fully 100% bought in. I want to do competitive dance. I want to like join every single class. I love it. This is my thing. And so we often have dancers who might go from doing 2 or 3 hours of recreational dance a week to all of a sudden jumping to like 9 or 10 hours. And the intensity that they're training at is higher. It's technically more difficult. And these dancers will probably fall into that category of what we would consider to be load naive. They just have not had a chance to build up the capacity to be able to tolerate these loads in a kind of gradual systemic way. And so these dancers, if we can make that progression sort of gradual enough and systematic enough, they will likely develop that load tolerance. So they will develop the capacity to be able to withstand those loads. But depending on lots of different variables, but potentially how quickly those loads increase, where they are in terms of, growth and like adolescent growth spurts and, even just like fueling levels and how much sleep they're getting and all sorts of things that play into that, we can have dancers who then enter into this kind of zone or area that we would consider to be like load intolerant or load sensitive. And these are not just those young dancers progressing into higher levels of dance. This can happen in any dancer where they may sort of end up in this kind of load intolerant or load sensitive zone. And so these are dancers who are potentially struggling to manage the level of physical stress or the demand that's being placed on them. And this, like I said, can be from a variety of reasons. This can be related to overtraining for sure. So our dancers who are overtraining and are under recovering or their bodies are not able to recover efficiently enough, they will likely fall into this category. And these are going to be our dancers who end up, sort of dealing with pain or fatigue or, repetitive injuries and things like that. And so that's this idea of overtraining or load intolerance, this idea that they cannot tolerate the loads that their body is being placed under. And then we have the category that we hope that all of our dancers can fall into, and these are our dancers who are load tolerant. And so these are dancers who, if we can gradually build them up and develop their ability to handle higher workloads or higher loading, then they are generally going to be able to withstand those loads better. And so the goal is to try and create environments and to create scenarios where we have load tolerant dancers. And like I said, we can do that through gradually increasing the loading that they're undergoing. So we don't want, or we want to try and avoid as much as we can, sudden spikes in training load or training intensity or all of those variables. We want to have progressive exposure to dance and like athletic demands. And so this is often where I think dancers maybe fall short, is that dancers maybe have progressive exposure to dance skills and those like steps that they're learning in class, but we don't always have progressive exposure to athletic qualities or even just those movement patterns or the strength and capacity within the body to be able to withstand those loads. And so this looks like some of our strength and conditioning or cross training, like I was talking about a couple weeks ago on the podcast. That is where some of that stuff comes into play so that we can have this progressive exposure in our dancer populations. Creating load-tolerant dancers also requires adequate recovery and really optimizing recovery in whatever ways work best for individual dancers. I've done podcast episodes on rest and recovery for dancers before, and there's lots of variables that fall into that. And so they may not look exactly the same for every single dancer, but a dancer who is under recovering is going to be a dancer who is overloaded. So if we want to create load tolerant dancers, we need to be focusing on recovery as well. And then we want to think about that sort of like consistent and quality training, like I was talking about earlier in the episode. So when I say quality training, I'm not just talking about, a quote unquote good teacher. I'm talking about how is it that we are approaching class structures and what is it that we are trying to build in our dancers as they're progressing through their training so that it's not just drilling steps over and over and over and over again. So I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up today. Like I said, it's a little bit of a different approach, but still sort of the same information that you've heard me talk about before when we talk about, load management in dancers, and especially when we've talked about kind of overtraining, but it's looking at it from a little bit of this different lens that perhaps the actual loading is not the problem. It's our dancers' preparation for that loading or ability to withstand that loading. So if we come back to that original scenario of this studio owner who reached out to me, who, her case was her dancers are not training excessive numbers of hours in a week. And I know that. I know her program well. But it is likely the case that a lot of the dancers who were dealing with injuries were actually under-prepared for these loads. So although the total loading was not, she didn't have dancers dancing 20, 30, 40 hours a week, the dancers were not actually prepared. They were almost undertrained. So they were not prepared for those loads, even though the loads themselves were not excessive. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And like I said, it's all kind of the same thing, but just looking at it from a little bit of a different lens, where sometimes we need to pull back and think, okay, we don't just need to randomly take hours away from a program. In some cases, we may need to actually cut hours that dancers are training. But in a lot of cases, what we actually need to do is think about how do we build the capacity within this dancer to withstand that training load. And especially if we think about dancers in professional dance settings, cutting the hours is often not an option. Like, you're contracted into certain numbers of hours of dance a week. And so if we are dealing with some of these issues in a dancer in a setting like that, it's not an option to say, well, do you know what you should really be doing? Like 10 hours less a week, when that is their contract and that is what they're expected to do. So we need to look at how do we then prepare them for that loading? What is it that they're missing? Is it a recovery piece? Is it a progressive overload piece? What is it to prepare them? So that's where I'm going to leave it today. Hopefully that sparked a little bit of food for thought. If you have any questions, thoughts, want to chat about this further, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me by email at email is in the show notes. You can reach me on social media at Dance Physio Erika. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.